thank you very much. How are you all? Good, that's nice, thank you. Well, I'm fine too, thanks for asking. But the interactive bit is later, so then. Anyway, I've been told by the organisers to not so much tell you what I think about environmental issues, which I'd be happy to do ad nauseum, but to tell you a bit about how my views have changed. And so I've prepared a presentation which is kind of telling my life story and how I came to be more of what I hope I am today, which is an evidence-based environmentalist, rational environmentalist, something like that. So it's kind of trying to align the skeptic point of view with the environmental one, because oftentimes they have been in conflict, and my own life, in fact, in many ways, illustrates that. So I would start by saying I'm an environmentalist, as I was introduced as, and I've always been an environmentalist. And I think my life story really has been about trying to figure out what that word means. Does it mean obeying some unwritten code of loyalty within this tribe, this social tribe, which is the environmental movement? Or do I owe my allegiance to something a bit more objective in an intellectual sense, and something which I have to figure out for myself? Now, I know you're all here as independent thinkers, as skeptics, and many of you will be leaders in your own different fields, whatever they are. And I don't count myself as a leader in the environmental movement, and I never did. In the press recently, because of things I've said about my previous role as an anti-GMO activist, I was called a leader of that part of the movement, but I wasn't. I'm the first to admit that. And in fact, I was a follower. And you can see me somewhere in this picture. I'm not sure which person I am. But the fact that I wasn't thinking for myself then, really, and I was kind of following this tribe, was really the problem. And I've been called a heretic more recently, which of course implies a sort of valiant heroism. But actually, when I look back today, my overwhelming emotion is shame. And I'm ashamed that it took me 15 years to learn to think for myself on this issue, and to pluck up the courage to publicly question the beliefs of my peers in the environmental movement. But anyway, let's back up a bit. I want to just take you back to my upbringing. As a child, I spent 3 formative years in what must be the world's most geographically spectacular country, Peru. So I went to school in Lima, learned all about the Incas, who didn't have the wheel, but managed to build a successful and sophisticated civilization in the inhospitable landscape of the Andes. And that landscape captivated me. Seeing it despoiled by unregulated mining activities was something I'll never forget. And driving through this particular town in the High Sierra called La Arroya, it's reputed to be the most polluted town on the planet. And going through it, I could see that all the hills around were lifeless, and the river ran this unnatural colour of green. And children in the town have very high lead levels in their blood, and very high resulting rates of illness, and also and premature death. And that, of course, would never happen in a developed country. And at the time, Peru was desperately poor. This was in the early 1980s. And another of my formative memories, really, was seeing children in the Central Valley living in mud huts in the shadow of Peru's highest mountain, who sported potbellies from malnutrition. And this wasn't so long ago. And when we drove through the Andes, us kids with our parents in our battered Land Rover, these little kids in rags and ponchos and these funny bowler hats they used to wear would run from one hairpin bend to the other, and me and my sister would throw coins out of the window into their upturned hats, a bit like medieval royalty dispersing tidbits from our carriage. Now, I didn't know the word at the time because I was only 8 years old, but what I was seeing was real poverty, of course. And many of these children probably died before they were able to grow up. None of them would have enjoyed the kinds of privileges and opportunities that I've been blessed with in my life. So, I grew up determined to see a more equal world, and one where poverty would become a thing of the past rather than a permanent state of being for so many of the world's population. And today, actually, the end of absolute poverty is at last in sight, as I'll talk about a bit more in a minute. But back in the UK, back in England, we lived in the countryside. I used to go out into the fields and collect mushrooms. It's a very different place from Peru, of course, with all its jungles and its deserts and its glaciated mountains. But England also has its attractions of a gentler sort, the sort of sense of antiquity, the shifting of the seasons, things like that. Now, my father was a geologist, and that's why we were in Peru. And I guess in retrospect, I wish I'd discovered the joys of science a bit earlier in my life. Instead, I dropped science at GCSE, went to university to study history and politics. I founded an environmental page on our student newspaper at Edinburgh University. When I left there to be an environmental journalist, I quickly got involved with the protest scene, the UK protest scene, which was kind of loosely known as Earth First at the time. And we were doing a whole bunch of stuff, campaigning against roads and runways, and it was in this context that I first discovered the issue of GMOs, genetically modified foods, which I'm going to primarily talk about today because I think it's such an important symbolic and a real issue. Now at the time, and this was back in 1996, my information came from Greenpeace, for want of a better way of putting it, and the other environmental groups. And as I said earlier, I never thought to question it. If it came with a Greenpeace logo, I thought it was gospel, even if the references at the back of Greenpeace reports tended to refer to Friends of the Earth, and those from the back of Friends of the Earth reports tended to refer to Greenpeace. At the time, that was good enough for me. Now, as I say, that was 96. I was 23 years old and full of righteous passion for saving the planet, which I think everyone should have when they're young. I used to do workshops at protest gatherings about the evils of Monsanto, this big American, and American was part of the problem, corporation, which was causing genetic pollution by transferring DNA between species in order to apparently control the entire food chain through intellectual property rights, through patents. Now, our response to this was direct action. We went into the fields, as you saw earlier, day or night, wherever these new mutant crops were being grown, and we destroyed them. We called it decontamination. I hired buses in one case, and a whole load of us actually went into Monsanto's headquarters and occupied it. This, I think in retrospect, was the most successful campaign I've ever been involved in. We had the Daily Mail on our side, we had Prince Charles, we had the Yogic Flyers from the Natural Law Party, and much of the general public who were incidentally scared by the whole mad cow disease issue and saw GMOs, GM foods, as the latest in this trend of technological contamination of our food system. And I think we really opposed all technology in agriculture in many ways. You know, we used to sing songs about the Luddites as having been historically misunderstood, and we proposed organic and permaculture as the obvious, unquestionable solutions that the whole world should adopt immediately. We saw farmers who used pesticides as ecological villains, who were poisoning our food, our air, and our water for no apparent reason other than sheer malice. Now note there are some real issues here. The techniques for combining DNA at a molecular level were unproven back then in one sense, and perhaps we were right to be cautious, to be skeptical. But any real sense of precaution was wrapped up in a much broader agenda, of course, which in retrospect I think was anti-modern in principle. It was certainly anti-science, and we preferred adjectives like holistic to real empirical data. I also think we were utopians in an ideological sense, trying to recreate some bucolic imagined idol of the past, some ideal of an agrarian society. Now, I guess it was juvenile and naive, but the myths that underpinned this way of thinking are still very much prevalent, I think, and to some extent are at the heart of environmentalist thinking amongst the movement today, which is why it's still so difficult to get people to consider this issue rationally. It's about values, and it's about gut instincts. It's an emotional commitment which is deeper probably than the political difference between being Labour or Conservative or Republican and Democrat. It's more like a kind of religious thing. It's more like a Muslim-Christian difference, and I think it's as difficult to change and to shake off. Now, one of the reasons I don't mind so much being called a traitor or worse now is that I have to recognise how intolerant, really, I was of other viewpoints back then, and frankly how authoritarian my belief system was. You may have heard of the Danish academic Bjorn Lomborg. He published a book in 2001 criticising the environmental movement for exaggerating problems, and I called him a liar and threw a cream pie in his face. The video of this is still on YouTube, but I'm not going to show it to you because it's too fucking embarrassing. Years later, by the way, I did apologise to Bjorn, and even though we still don't agree on many things, I guess I took a lesson from the fact that he was gracious to me for that attack rather than angry. And I also learned something, even though we didn't agree, about the value of questioning orthodoxy. So I guess back then I would have probably burnt Bjorn Lomborg's book in the street, but I was also starting to write my own book, which was about climate change. And my idea was to travel around the world, starting in 2000, and to witness and document the first impacts of global warming as they were being felt in different places, geographically and in different ways. Now, I know it sounds quite hackneyed now, but at the time, I think I was among the first to do this from a journalistic perspective. And certainly there wasn't the kind of the overwhelming observed evidence for climate change that I think we're all so familiar with now. And the book ended up going by this title, High Tide, News from a Warming World. And this next slide shows my first destination, which was a little Eskimo community in Alaska called Shishmaref. And here the village elders shared with me their own observations that the village was eroding into the sea because the coastline was no longer protected by sea ice, which was disappearing earlier in the season and then refreezing later. They were getting bigger storms, people felt under threat, houses were actually tipping into the sea as a result. And these were people, don't forget, who lived very close to the land. They lived off hunting walrus, polar bears, seals and so on. So they did know a lot about the changing weather and the conditions of the ice from their own personal experiences. But these accounts, of course, were anecdotal. And I wanted to get the full story, so I had to begin to look seriously at the science. And this means looking at longer-term data sets covering a much wider geographical area to see whether what the villagers were telling me personally represented a broader trend across the whole Arctic. And looking at the satellite trend, I could see that it did. But remember, I'm a history graduate. So I had to start right at the beginning in terms of my own research on this, learning how to read a scientific paper, or at least get past the introduction and the synopsis, getting to know the different names of the different journals where I could look this stuff up in, familiarizing myself with the jargon and the technical language which is inherent to the scientific process. And then I began to apply this in different places I visited, the drowning Pacific island of Tuvalu, where tide gauge information and satellite altimetry confirm that sea level rise was a real and present danger to the survival of that state. Also here in Peru, where in the climax of the high tide book in 2002, I returned to a remote glacier that my father had mapped back in 1980 on the left, to find that 22 years later, when I visited it in 2002, it had disappeared completely. You may recognize the photo from Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth film, where this appeared and where he wrongly identified the glacier as being in Argentina. But exciting as my adventures were in the real world, I was back in Oxford, where shut in the university library over many days and nights, winter and summer. For 2 whole years, I gradually fell in love. And I fell in love with a process, a method, the method of science. I guess you could say I found my inner geek, which was always there waiting to get out. And science is so simple and yet so beautiful. It's surely the greatest gift that humanity has bestowed on itself over the last 4 centuries has been this reasoned use of data. As a history graduate, I'd read Voltaire, but somehow missed this supreme intellectual product of the Enlightenment, which was the scientific method. I never really stopped, I don't think, to understand why the textbook we had about the 18th century was called The Age of Reason. Now, as an environmentalist, I was very attuned to ideology and assertion, but science offered, and I began to realize there's some more objective window into truth because it's based on evidence, and crucially it can change when it's presented with new and compelling alternative evidence. There's a great quote from Tim Minchin, which you've probably seen, where he says, "Science adjusts its views based on what's observed. Faith is the denial of observation so that belief can be preserved." I believe this is in a song, but I don't know the tune. If any of you do, you can sing it in the Q&A. Anyway, little by little over the coming years, I found that my faith-based view of the world was coming into contradiction with my scientific one, and no more so than in my original campaigning battleground of GMOs. Climate change, on the other hand, was very easy because my faith and my science were well aligned. What Greenpeace and all my environmental allies were saying about global warming was broadly true. According to the best scientific evidence, such as observed temperature changes, and whilst you can and you should always argue about specific scientific uncertainties, it clearly wasn't the Greens who were the denialists in the case of climate change, but those on the political right who didn't like the whole idea of global warming and tried to pretend as a result that essentially it didn't exist. And so I spent much of the time in those years cutting my teeth in the media, arguing vociferously against climate change skeptics, who I called deniers. And how did I know I was right? Well, because I'd read all these hundreds of scientific papers. I'd assessed countless data sets examining all aspects of climatology, paleoclimatology, oceanography, glaciology, and so on. I knew I was right because I was the one who'd assessed the evidence, and I saw myself very much as standing up for science. So whilst science isn't subject to the vote, it's not a democracy, and most scientists worth their salt will be the first to tell you this, conclusions do strengthen with the accumulating weight of evidence. And when hundreds of experts in the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change made their pronouncements, I felt this was something that the world should take seriously, and I still very much do. The IPCC predicted global warming of 2 to 6 degrees by 2100 in its report, and I used this as the basis for my next book, which I called 6 Degrees. This was made into a film by National Geographic, and once again, I rode in to do battle with the climate change deniers, lectured them about the importance of peer-reviewed science and the expert consensus and the need for objectivity and evidence to trump faith and politics. And yet I didn't, at the time even, apply this equally to myself. Here's something I wrote in 2008. Probably, I'd like to say this is my last incredibly stupid piece of writing, but you never know. And this was my very last anti-GMO article, which I knocked together for The Guardian, at their insistence, by the way. This wasn't my idea. So there I am trying to justify myself. Anyway, I knocked it together in 20 minutes, probably in an internet cafe, if I remember rightly, using all the usual NGO sources, and without really the most basic scientific understanding of the issue. This article too, by the way, is still online on the Guardian website, and I would urge you not to go and read it. But if you do, you will see the comments underneath, which really forced me to think seriously about changing my mind and doing so publicly. Around this time, by the way, I was already coming into conflict with my environmentalist allies in the movement because I'd publicly spoken out in support of nuclear power as a solution to climate change. And so I found out very quickly what it was like to be vilified, called a traitor, and subject to emotional blackmail, most of it coming through email. And it was pretty unpleasant, but I'm actually quite a stubborn person and I don't like being bullied. So I did some research, and bit by bit I found out that pretty much everything that was said by the anti-nuclear campaigners is untrue. And bit by bit as a result, my faith in my fellow Greens began to gradually fall apart. On nuclear, in fact, the environmental movement is partly responsible for causing climate change because its anti-nuclear activities in the 1970s led to the building of hundreds of new coal-fired power stations in the US, in Europe, and in other parts of the world. And in some places, actually, there were half-built nuclear plants which were actually converted to coal. They basically put coal boilers in the reactor rooms, and in order to placate the environmental lobby at the time. And I've got no great doubt that nuclear is probably the most safest form of energy that's ever been invented, and yet the Greens had unfairly demonised it as the most dangerous and ignored all reasoned debate about this issue. So believe me, I really didn't relish refighting this battle when I realised that the environmental movement was also wrong about GMOs. In fact, it took me 3 years to summon up the courage to write about it properly, and even then I was very restrained in the language that I used in my most recent book called The God Species. But I did feel a growing weight of responsibility, because I was beginning to understand that what I've been involved in back then had done real damage in the world, both to the environment and to food security, as well as to the institution of science, which I now held so dear. So my initial response was to stay behind the scenes and to try and help the scientists who are still under constant threat of attack from anti-GMO activists. And many of these activists, of course, I've known personally for years as friends. Last summer, I'm sure many of you will have seen this in the media, a public institute called Rothamsted Research, Plant Science Institute, was running a trial of GMO wheat. which has a gene inserted to make the wheat produce a pheromone called E-beta farnesene, which is an alarm signal to aphids and protects the crop against aphid infestation without the need for toxic pesticides. So clearly this is potentially environmentally advantageous, but the activists had promised to destroy it anyway, really for no other reason than that it was a GMO. Now this is a publicly funded scientific research institute. This is not Monsanto, and this was research with clear potential environmental benefits, yet the anti-GMO activists were clearly unable to recognise any difference. Working with Sense About Science, which I hope you all support, I work with the scientists in the institute to help them speak up for their research, and they made this YouTube video, which I'll just show you a clip of, pleading with the activists to allow their experiment to go ahead. I think it's great to see these researchers standing up for their own work.
We heard the protesters are planning to attack our GMO trial site on the 27th of May. We ask them to please consider our message in the spirit of openness and dialogue. We know we cannot stop you taking the action you're planning to take, but please reconsider before it's too late and before several years' worth of work to which we have been devoting our lives will be destroyed forever.
We appeal to you as environmentalists. We agree that agriculture should work with nature rather than against it. And in fact, that is what we are trying to do with our plants. We have developed this new variety of wheat which doesn't require treatment with an insecticide, and it uses a natural aphid repellent which already widely occurs in nature and is produced by more than 400 different plant species. We have engineered this into the wheat genome so that the wheat can do the same thing to defend itself. Are you really against this because it could have a lot of environmental benefit? Or is it simply because you distrust it because it's a GMO? The suggestion that our wheat is part cow is simply not true. The gene that we have added was synthetically made in the lab, and even with regular plant breeding, the wheat that we grow today has undergone many genetic changes.
Our research is to shed light on questions about safety and usefulness of new varieties of staple food crops which we all depend on. We must stress that this trial is for research purposes only, for gathering knowledge. It is not being commercially grown. As activists, you may prefer never to know whether our new wheat variety would work, but we believe you're in the minority.
You seem to think, even before we've had a chance to test the trial, that our GM wheat variety is bad. But how can you know this? It's clearly not through scientific investigation, because we've not even had any chance to do any tests yet. You state on your website that there's serious doubt that the aphid alarm pheromone being produced by this GM wheat is going to have any effect anyway. And you could very well be right. But if you trash the trial, none of us are ever going to know, are we? And do you really want that?
Our work is publicly funded. We have pledged that our results will not be patented and will not be owned by any private company. If our wheat proves to be beneficial, we want it to be made available to farmers at minimum cost. If you destroy publicly funded research, you leave us in a situation where only big corporations can afford the drastic security measures required to continue biotechnology research, and you therefore further promote a situation you say you are trying to avoid.
You may not know much about Rothamsted. You may not realise that we're the institute that has one of the longest running agricultural and environmental experiments in the world. These are plots that have been receiving agricultural treatments, and we've been measuring the ecological consequences of these since 1843. Now, some of these sensitive plots are very close to the GM trial site, and we're really worried that people trampling these sites are going to compromise the ecological experiment that's been running for nearly 200 years.
When you come to visit us on the 27th of May, please don't come in the spirit of destruction. Please come and engage in conversation with us. We would really like to show you our work and explain to you why we really think that it could benefit the environment in the future. As scientists, we know that we do not have all the answers, but that's why we need to conduct experiments, and that's why, please, we ask you not to destroy them.
Yeah, so, I mean, yeah, give them a round of applause. And I guess what is so inspiring about that is that they're speaking with such passion, but they're obviously so uncomfortable because they're in front of a camera. And these are, I claim to be a geek, but they're real geeks, and they're the ones who have to speak up for their work. And when the promised action came on the 27th of May, I think it was essentially a damp squib. We even organised a counter-protest called Geeks in the Park. Maybe one or two of you were there. And I think this was the first, you were there, I remember well. This was probably the first kind of anti-GMO protest that there'd ever been. And I was certainly proud to have been involved in it. And I think also we all sensed that something had begun to shift on this issue, and I've picked up on this a lot recently. The media coverage the scientists got was very positive. There was a petition for their cause, which was on the Sense About Science website, which got 6,000 signatures in the space of a week and a half from people from all walks of life. And they weren't people who necessarily supported GMOs per se, but didn't want to see experiments destroyed before the results could come in. And I think that was a really important message here, was that the process of science and the process of knowledge gathering should go on and shouldn't be interrupted by people who don't even want the knowledge to ever become public. And sort of alongside this, one of the things that really incensed me was when Greenpeace in Australia did actually destroy another GMO wheat experiment which was being carried out by another publicly funded research institute there. This genetic change was intended to improve the nutritional quality of the wheat, but Greenpeace destroyed it anyway, and in the process, by the way, nearly terminated an experiment which has since accidentally found dramatic yield improvements of somewhere upwards of 30%. So even though Greenpeace was only doing what I myself had done a decade earlier, something inside me snapped when I saw this, and I was no longer afraid to confront them publicly, and moreover I felt some responsibility to speak out against their destruction of science. I also found out more about Greenpeace's campaign against golden rice. You probably know about this, but basically the environmental movement has tried for many years to stop vitamin A enriched rice from reaching poor people around the world because it's GMO, despite the fact that vitamin A deficiency kills hundreds of thousands of children per year and blinds many more. And I realised this was no better than campaigning against immunisation or against polio vaccination or something like that. Not just a denial of science, but a denial of basic humanitarian values. And again, this isn't something that I felt able to stay quiet about. So by the time I was invited to speak at this Oxford Farming Conference in January this year, I'd stopped caring completely what my old green friends thought about me. And I could no longer maintain any pretense that the anti-GMO position was at all respectable or justified, and indeed was anything other than anti-science denialism of the worst kind. If we take a lesson from climate change science, the expert consensus on the safety of GMOs is just as strong as the consensus on the reality of climate change. Look at the words I've bolded there. Crop improvement by modern molecular techniques of biotechnology is safe. List the reputable academic institutions who've made this point essentially. Consuming foods containing ingredients derived from GM crops is no riskier than consuming foods derived from conventional selective breeding. And yet the green groups were busy attacking the very scientists who penned this consensus statement, creating their own bunch of pseudo-experts and spreading myths and propaganda that were not only evidence-free, but the exact opposite of objective reality. So it was time for me to break cover and speak out, I thought. And before giving this speech, I felt a little like you must do when you're confessing to a murder or going on trial or something like that, because it's kind of one of those moments when there's no going back. And I expected to be attacked and vilified again, and that's indeed what happened. This is one of the little Facebook things that was proliferating in social media. I'll leave you to read it as we go along. But what really surprised me was the headlines that just me making an apology as a former anti-GMO activist made around the world. My speech went viral and was read by at least 1 million people, and voluntarily translated into Italian, Vietnamese. You're all reading this, aren't you? It says, please share this so people will learn what a vile, loathsome creature I actually am. Thanks. And what really annoys me, that isn't even me. Anyway, it's only been about 3 months since then, but I feel about 10 years older. And I really think that people were interested in my story internationally, not because there was anything interesting about me, because believe me, there isn't, but precisely because I'm not the only one to have realised that the essential anti-GMO case was always a lie. I made the comparison earlier with anti-vaccination campaigners. This issue, I think, is being discussed next in this room at 3 p.m, so I urge you to come along. It's a very important issue. And I think there is a clear parallel. Indeed, many of the same people, the people who made that Facebook mock-up about me, were anti-vaccination campaigners. They all organise under these shadowy banners like natural health. And there's always somebody out there making a lot of money out of people's gullibility and living in a very big house on the west coast of California. It's worth remembering that Monsanto, by the way, for all its failings, is strongly regulated, and the natural health crowd, on the other hand, can sell anything they like without any independent tests on either safety or efficacy. So today I hope and believe that we've passed a tipping point on this issue, where to be anti-GMO is increasingly seen for what it really is, which is to be reactionary, to be backward-looking and against innovation, not just in agriculture, but more widely as well. To take another example, in India, activists have stopped the introduction of a BT eggplant, which would have dramatically reduced insecticide use there. The result of this isn't that Indian eggplant farmers have suddenly all turned organic, but that they continued doing what they've always done before, which was to send around small children with buckets of pesticide, which they actually physically dipped the eggplants into, not just poisoning thousands of children per year, but leaving an incredibly toxic residue on the crop that everybody then eats. In fact, in Kenya and Uganda, there's a disease of banana now, a bacterial wilt disease, which has essentially can be fixed with GMO banana, but the governments there have banned GMOs, and if you're a scientist, you take this out of the laboratory, you can end up in jail for 10 years, and that's if you're trying to protect food security for people there. So the situation today is critical. We've got to double food production, we've got to do this on the same amount of land that we're currently cultivating today, and we've got to feed a population which is going to be growing past 9 billion by 2050. Some people, as an aside, are always insisting that we must slow population growth, and population is the elephant in the room, but the truth is the average global fertility rate is already down at 2.5. Natural replacement is 2.1, so we're not that far above that. The reason the population is increasing is that fewer children are dying young. Therefore, they're growing up to be parents themselves, and therefore the population continues to increase. In Africa, infant mortality rates have plummeted in almost every country. These are annual changes of 10% reductions in infant mortality in some of these countries, which is an enormous good news story, which is very little known about. And I think back to those malnourished children that I saw in Peru all those years ago, and I'm delighted that poverty in that country, a country of my childhood, has declined by 50% in the space of just about a decade. And around the world, hundreds of millions of people in Africa, Asia and South America are joining the middle class and having better lives. Children growing up there today can expect better education, better healthcare, better life opportunities than their parents would ever have dreamed about or thought possible. And the same is true of many other countries around the world as well. Perhaps one of these Bangladeshi children will be the next Norman Borlaug, the man who saved 1 billion lives because he helped feed the world with the Green Revolution in the 1960s and 1970s. Today we need a new Green Revolution which protects ecosystems at the same time as giving the world's poor a chance to develop and to share all of the marvels and opportunities of modern industrial society. So, what have I learned over the last 15 years? Well, I guess I've learned that you don't stop learning when you leave school, if anything, or university. If anything, I've been on a steeper learning curve in recent years than I ever was when I was studying history and politics with my post-Marxist, post-structuralist professors at Edinburgh University. I've discovered a whole fascinating area other than climate change and molecular biology, the extraordinary nature of the code of DNA shared by all living things, and how unlocking the secrets of this code can help us, where we can harness biology to, as well as chemistry in food production and defeating disease. Kind of, as a scientist at Rothamsted said, working with nature rather than against it, in other words. And I've learned that scientific evidence should be especially valued where it contradicts your worldview rather than where it merely supports it. Science's most valuable trait, in other words, could be that it by definition challenges our inherent psychological preference for or tendency towards confirmation bias. And I guess I've also learned about pragmatism, as we all do as we grow older, and how making the perfect the enemy of the good is a recipe for, well, not just for failure, but potentially for disaster. Most of all, I guess I've learned the value of optimism. And I don't mean futile hope, but optimism in the sense of believing that problems can be solved in the real world rather than in some sort of imaginary post-revolutionary or pre-industrial utopia. And at the root of all this, I guess, lies the ultimately very humbling experience of not just criticizing other people's mistakes, but learning from the experience of one's own. Anyway, thanks for listening. Let's open this up and we'll take questions and other interactions that you want to have. Thank you very much.